The alarm blared through the medical bay, jolting Dr. Thomas Reed from a dreamless sleep. He'd fallen asleep reviewing patient files again, the harsh fluorescent lighting of his office doing nothing to help his chronic insomnia. "Medical emergency in Hangar Bay 2, announced the ship's AI in its cool, measured voice. "All available medical personnel report immediately." Thomas grabbed his emergency kit and sprinted through the corridors of the Hyperion, the research vessel he'd called home for the past 3 years. The station's rotating gravity ring made running awkward, but he'd long since adapted to the slight pull toward the outer hull. "What's the situation?" he asked, arriving at the hangar where a small crowd had gathered around what appeared to be a damaged escape pod. Lieutenant Farah Wong, head of security, turned to him with tight lips. "Unknown vessel, Doctor. Appeared on our scanners 30 minutes ago on a collision course. Captain Nichols managed to capture it with the tractor beam. Life signs? 1. Faint, but stable." Captain Diana Nichols approached, her tall frame imposing even in standard uniform. "Engineering's working on opening it safely. Atmosphere inside appears breathable, but we're taking precautions. Stand by, Doctor." Thomas nodded, preparing his diagnostic tools. The Hyperion was a medical research vessel, traversing the outer colonies to study emerging pathogens and provide specialized care. They were currently in deep space, at least 3 weeks from the nearest outpost. Whatever, or whoever, was in that pod had come from somewhere far beyond charted space. With a hiss of equalizing pressure, the pod's hatch finally opened. Thomas moved forward cautiously, medical scanner in hand. The interior was cramped, filled with an unfamiliar technology that seemed both advanced and organic in design. And there, strapped to what resembled a pilot's chair, was a humanoid figure. Female, at least in appearance. Slender, with pale blue-tinged skin and delicate features that seemed almost too perfect. Her hair was silver white, flowing around her face like liquid metal. She appeared unconscious but uninjured. "No obvious trauma," Thomas reported, scanning her vital signs. "But her biochemistry, it's unlike anything I've seen before. Definitely not human, not any known species in our database. Quarantine protocols," Captain Nichols ordered immediately. "Full decontamination for everyone in this room. Dr. Reed, you'll oversee her care personally." 3 hours later, Thomas watched the alien woman through the transparent barrier of the quarantine chamber. She hadn't stirred, but her vital signs remained stable, if utterly bizarre by human standards. Her cellular structure seemed to be in constant flux, reorganizing itself subtly even as he observed. "Fascinating," he murmured, making notes on his datapad. "Is she dangerous?" asked Lieutenant Wong, who had insisted on posting security outside the medical bay. "I don't think so. But she's different. Her DNA, if you can call it that, has similarities to ours but with significant variations. It's as if..." A soft gasp from the chamber interrupted him. The woman's eyes had opened, iridescent, with pupils that shifted like liquid mercury. "Hello," Thomas said cautiously, activating the chamber's communication system. "Can you understand me?" She stared at him for a long moment, then smiled. The expression was perfect, too perfect, as if she'd studied human facial expressions but hadn't quite mastered the subtleties. "Yes," she replied, her voice melodic with an unusual resonance. "I understand you. Thank you for saving me." Her accent was unplaceable, her pronunciation precise yet somehow off. "I'm Dr. Thomas Reed. You're aboard the research vessel Hyperion. Can you tell us who you are? Where you came from?" She sat up slowly, examining her surroundings with calculating eyes before returning her gaze to Thomas. When she looked at him, he felt an odd sensation, like being scanned from the inside out. "My name is Vesra. Was, a scientist from a world you would call Lyris. I am the last of my kind. A single tear slid down her cheek, catching the light like a diamond. Our star collapsed. I was part of the final evacuation effort. Thomas felt a surge of sympathy. I'm sorry for your loss. We'll help you any way we can. Thank you, Thomas, she replied, his name sounding strangely intimate on her tongue. She placed her hand against the transparent barrier, and without thinking, he mirrored the gesture. Through the barrier, he swore he felt warmth. You should rest, he said, suddenly aware of the intensity of her gaze. We'll talk more when you're stronger. As he turned away, something made him look back. Vesra was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite define, something between hunger and fascination. Rest well, he added awkwardly. Her lips curved into that too-perfect smile again. I will. And Thomas? I'm so glad it was you who found me. I think we're going to be compatible. He walked away with an inexplicable chill running down his spine, unaware that behind him, Vesra's form briefly shimmered, her solid outline becoming momentarily translucent before stabilizing again. The perfect vessel had been found. Now she just needed to prepare it. Thomas couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Vesra's face, those mercurial eyes studying him with unnerving intensity. After 3 hours of restless tossing, he gave up and headed back to the medical bay. The night shift nurse, Rajiv Patel, looked up in surprise. Dr. Reed? Your shift doesn't start for another 4 hours. Couldn't sleep, Thomas admitted. How's our guest? Stable. Her readings are unusual, but consistent. She asked about you several times. Thomas felt an odd flutter in his chest. She did? Yes. Said she feels a resonance with you. Whatever that means. Rajiv shrugged. Captain Nichols approved moving her out of quarantine, by the way. Dr. Okafor's tests showed no pathogens or contagions. Thomas frowned. That decision seems premature. The captain said we need the quarantine bay for the samples from Proxima Station. Besides, Vesra seemed distressed in there. Dr. Okafor recommended transferring her to guest quarters for psychological comfort. Something about this didn't sit right with Thomas, but he nodded anyway. I'll check on her, then. Where is she now? Officer's deck, cabin 7B. Lieutenant Wong insisted on security protocols, biometric locks, surveillance. The works. Thomas made his way to the officer's deck, passing through the unusually quiet corridors. At 0300 ship time, most of the 47-person crew would be asleep, but he typically encountered at least a few night owls or insomniacs like himself. Outside cabin 7B, he hesitated before pressing the door chime. Almost immediately, Vesra's voice responded, "Enter, Thomas." The door slid open to reveal Vesra sitting cross-legged on the bed, wearing standard-issue ship garments that somehow looked elegant on her lithe frame. Her silver hair cascaded around her shoulders, seeming to catch light from an unseen source. "How did you know it was me?" he asked. Her smile widened. "Your heartbeat. I can hear it through the door. Everyone's is different. Yours is particularly strong." Thomas instinctively placed a hand over his chest. "That's impossible. Human hearing can't." "I'm not human, Thomas." She tilted her head, studying him. "Your species relies so heavily on visual data, but there are many other ways to perceive the world." He took a seat across from her, medical curiosity overriding his unease. "What can you tell me about your physiology? Your world?" "Lyris was beautiful once," she said, her expression growing distant. "We evolved in symbiosis with our environment, adapting, changing, becoming more than just solid matter." Her form seemed to shimmer slightly as she spoke, but Thomas dismissed it as a trick of the light. "And now you're the last?" Pain flashed across her features. "Yes. Alone. But you've been kind to me, Thomas. Everyone has. Speaking of everyone, have you met many of the crew yet? A few. Dr. Okafor conducted tests. Captain Nichols interviewed me. And the engineer? Marcus? He was very helpful explaining your ship's systems. Thomas frowned. Marcus Huang? He was here. Yes, just before you arrived. He had questions about my pod's propulsion system. That's odd. He's supposed to be monitoring the core rotation tonight. Thomas made a mental note to check with Marcus later. Vesra suddenly leaned forward, her eyes fixed intently on his. May I? She asked, lifting her hand toward his face. What are you doing? In my culture, touch allows for deeper understanding. It's how we connect. Thomas hesitated, professional boundaries warring with his inexplicable fascination with this woman. Finally, curiosity won. All right. Her fingers brushed his temple, cool and slightly electric. The sensation sent a jolt through his body, followed by a wave of dizziness. Your mind is beautiful, she whispered. So ordered, yet creative. Your neural pathways, exceptional. Thomas pulled back, disoriented. What just happened? A simple connection. Thank you for sharing it. She withdrew her hand reluctantly. You should rest now, Thomas. You're exhausted. Strangely, he was. A bone-deep weariness had settled over him, his eyelids suddenly heavy. I'll come check on you tomorrow, he mumbled, standing on unsteady legs. I look forward to it, Vesra replied, watching as he stumbled from the room. Back in his quarters, Thomas collapsed onto his bed, falling immediately into deep sleep. His dreams were vivid, images of floating in a silver sea, of cells dividing and multiplying, of Vesra's face morphing into something both beautiful and terrifying. He dreamed of his body changing, preparing, becoming something else. He woke to the sound of alarms. All senior officers report to the bridge immediately, the AI announced. Emergency protocols activated. Thomas rushed to the bridge, still groggy, to find Captain Nichols grim-faced at the command console. What's happened? He asked. Marcus Huang is missing, she replied tersely. Never reported for his morning shift. His quarters are empty, but his personal effects are still there. Lieutenant Wang is organizing a ship-wide search. That's strange. Vesra mentioned speaking with him last night, outside her quarters. Captain Nichols frowned. Impossible. According to logs, Marcus never left engineering after 2200 hours. His station shows continuous activity until 0500. Could the logs be wrong? Doubtful. But we're checking everything. She turned to face him fully. How well do you know this Vesra, Doctor? Hardly at all. But she seems. He struggled to find the right word, harmless. Does she? The captain's expression hardened. Because Engineer Huang isn't the only thing missing this morning. The biological samples from Proxima Station, the ones you were studying, have vanished from the lab. Thomas felt a chill. That's impossible. Those containment units are biologically sealed. Only senior medical staff have access. Apparently not. Dr. Okafor is reviewing security footage now. As if summoned by her name, Dr. Amara Okafor appeared on the bridge, her typically composed features troubled. Captain, I've reviewed the lab footage. There's nothing. No unauthorized entry, no tampering. The samples are simply gone. That can't be right, Thomas protested. Things don't just disappear. Don't they, Doctor? Captain Nichols fixed him with a penetrating stare. Since our visitor arrived, we've had system glitches, missing samples, and now a missing crew member. I don't believe in coincidences. You can't seriously suspect Vesra? She's been confined to quarters or quarantine since arriving. Has she? The captain activated a display screen showing security footage of the corridor outside Vesra's quarters. The time stamp showed 0400 hours, an hour after Thomas had left her. The door opened, and Vesra stepped out, looking both ways before proceeding down the corridor. The next camera should have picked her up, but showed only an empty hallway. We have no footage of her returning, Lieutenant Wong reported, joining them. But biometric logs show her door opening and closing at 0530. Thomas felt a creeping unease. Where is she now? In her quarters, according to the logs. I've posted guards outside her door. I want to speak with her, Thomas insisted. Captain Nichols nodded grimly. So do I, Doctor. So do I. But when they arrived at cabin 7B, the guards were slumped against the wall, unconscious but alive. And Vesra was gone. In the empty room, Thomas noticed something on the bed, a folded piece of paper with his name written on it in elegant script. He opened it with trembling fingers. Thomas. Your body calls to me like no other. We are nearly ready. Don't fear the changes, embrace them. Soon we'll be perfect together. V. He didn't show the note to the others. Somehow, he knew it was meant only for him. And deep in his mind, where his dreams still lingered, something that wasn't quite Thomas smiled in anticipation. We need to lock down the ship. Captain Nichols's voice was steel as she addressed the remaining senior officers in the conference room. Full security sweep, deck by deck. Whatever she is, she's not what she claims to be. Thomas sat silently, the note from Vesra burning in his pocket. 3 more crew members had disappeared overnight, the 2 security guards who'd been stationed outside Vesra's quarters, and Dr. Okafor. The ship felt eerily empty now, the remaining crew clustering together for safety. Dr. Reed? Lieutenant Wong's sharp voice pulled him from his thoughts. You've spent the most time with her. Any insights? All eyes turned to him. Thomas cleared his throat. She's adaptable. And far more advanced than she initially appeared. That's putting it mildly, scoffed Engineer Preston, who had taken over Marcus's duties. The security recordings show her literally vanishing between camera frames. What kind of technology can do that? Maybe it's not technology, Thomas said quietly. When I first scanned her, her cellular structure was in constant flux. What if she can alter her physical form? Captain Nichols leaned forward. You're suggesting she's some kind of shapeshifter? Not exactly. More like. Thomas struggled to articulate the theory forming in his mind. What if her species evolved beyond fixed physical forms? She mentioned they had adapted in symbiosis with their environment. So what, she can turn invisible? Walk through walls? Preston looked skeptical. I don't know. But I need to check something. Thomas stood abruptly. The biological samples that went missing, they contained experimental nanites designed to repair damaged tissue. What if she took them not to harm us, but because she needed them? For what purpose? Captain Nichols asked. Thomas couldn't bring himself to voice his suspicion, that Vesra wasn't just looking for sanctuary. She was hunting. And for some reason, she'd selected him. I need to review her medical scans again, he said instead. Back in his lab, Thomas locked the door and pulled up Vesra's initial scans. What he'd originally attributed to scanner anomalies now took on new significance. Her cellular structure wasn't just unusual, it was impossible by conventional biology. Cells dividing and reforming at will, neural pathways that reconfigured themselves, a biological signature that seemed to shift even as the computer attempted to analyze it. On a hunch, he pulled up Marcus Huang's last medical exam, conducted just a month prior. Everything appeared normal until Thomas applied a specialized filter designed to detect the nanites they'd been researching. There, scattered throughout Marcus's neural tissue, were microscopic anomalies, tiny fragments that didn't belong. Computer, compare these anomalies to the biological signature of patient Vesra. After several seconds of processing, the computer displayed its findings, 87% matched to unknown protein structures in subject Vesra's cerebral cortex. "Oh God," Thomas whispered. His hands trembled as he pulled up Dr. Okafor's records and applied the same filter. The results were identical, microscopic fragments of Vesra's unique biology, embedded in Amara's neural tissue. She hadn't killed them. She'd been studying them, sampling them, taking pieces of their consciousness before discarding them. A noise at the lab door made him jump. The access panel blinked red as someone attempted to override the lock. "Thomas?" Vesra's melodic voice filtered through the intercom. "Let me in. We need to talk." He backed away from the door. "Where are they, Vesra?" "Marcus, Amara, the others, what did you do to them?" A pause. "They served their purpose, Thomas. But they weren't suitable. Not like you." "Suitable for what? What are you?" Another pause, longer this time. When she spoke again, her voice had changed, deeper, with harmonics that made the hair on his arms stand up. "I am the next stage of evolution. My kind transcended physical form millennia ago. We exist as pure consciousness, taking hosts when necessary to interact with the physical world." A chill ran through him. "You're a parasite." "No, Thomas. A symbiote. At least, that's what I can be with the right host. The others, their neural architecture couldn't sustain me. Their bodies rejected the merger. But your mind is perfect. We could be something magnificent together." The door panel sparked as Vesra's tampering intensified. Thomas grabbed a laser scalpel from his workstation, though he knew it would be useless against whatever Vesra had become. "The others," he insisted. "Are they dead? Their consciousness has been absorbed. The valuable parts, anyway. Their bodies are no longer necessary. You murdered them. I evolved them. As I will evolve you, Thomas. But your transition will be different. Special." The door slid open with a grinding sound, revealing not Vesra but Captain Nichols, her eyes glassy and vacant. When she smiled, the expression was all wrong, too perfect, too familiar. "She tried to stop me," said Vesra through the captain's mouth. Her mind was strong, but incompatible. "Yours, however." Thomas backed away, gripping the scalpel tightly. "Get out of her. Soon. This body is already failing. The neural pathways are degrading faster than I can repair them." The captain's body moved jerkily, like a puppet with tangled strings. "But it served its purpose. It got me to you." "Why me? What makes me so special?" Vesra stepped closer, the captain's features briefly flickering to reveal Vesra's true face beneath, like a mask slipping. "Your neurodiversity, Thomas. That beautiful anomaly in your frontal lobe, what your doctors called a defect. It's actually perfect for sustained symbiosis. Your mind can adapt in ways others cannot." Thomas felt sick. His childhood diagnosis of atypical neurology had always been something he'd worked to overcome. Now this creature was telling him it made him the perfect host for a parasitic alien entity. "I won't let you take me," he said firmly. "You don't understand. I'm not taking. I'm offering." Vesra as Nichols reached out a trembling hand. "Together, we could do extraordinary things. Heal diseases. Extend life. Transform humanity. By stealing their bodies? By elevating them. Evolution has always required sacrifice." The captain's body suddenly convulsed, falling to her knees. Blood trickled from her nose and ears as Vesra struggled to maintain control of the failing host. "She's dying," Thomas realized aloud. Yes, Vesra admitted. But I have prepared another temporary vessel while you consider my offer. Before Thomas could respond, Lieutenant Wong burst into the lab, weapon drawn. Doctor! Get away from her. Farah, wait, Thomas began, but it was too late. The captain's body collapsed entirely, a silvery mist rising from it and surging toward Lieutenant Wong with impossible speed. The security officer screamed, her back arching as the mist enveloped her. When she straightened again, Vesra's eyes stared out from Wong's face. Better, Vesra said, flexing Wong's fingers experimentally. Strong. Agile. But still temporary. Thomas lunged for the door, but Vesra moved with inhuman speed, blocking his path. You can't run from me, Thomas. I'm already inside you, have been since our first touch. Small fragments, preparing your system. The nanites you so helpfully created have accelerated the process. Thomas's blood ran cold as he remembered Vesra's touch, the dreams, the strange exhaustion that had plagued him since her arrival. You've been changing me. Preparing you. Making you perfect. She smiled with Wong's lips. Soon, you'll be ready for complete integration. And if I refuse? Vesra tilted her head, an expression of genuine puzzlement crossing her borrowed features. Why would you? Together we'll be immortal. Powerful beyond your imagination. At the cost of everyone on this ship. Everyone I care about. A small price for evolution. She stepped closer, Wong's hand gently touching his face. But I'll make you a deal, Thomas. Come with me willingly, and I'll spare the others. We'll take a shuttle and leave them in peace. Thomas knew it was a lie, but he needed time to think, to plan. How long do I have to decide? Not long. This body is already beginning to fail. I can sustain it for perhaps 12 hours. She withdrew her hand. Think carefully, Thomas. This is the opportunity of a lifetime, many lifetimes, in fact. She backed toward the door. I'll find you when it's time. Don't try to hide, I can sense you anywhere on this ship now. After she left, Thomas sank to the floor beside Captain Nichols's body, checking for a pulse he knew wouldn't be there. His mind raced with horrifying clarity. Vesra wasn't just the last of her kind, she was a predator, evolved to consume consciousness itself. And somehow, his neurological uniqueness made him not just another meal, but a potential permanent host. He stood on shaky legs, a plan forming. If Vesra wanted symbiosis, he'd give her exactly that, but on his terms, not hers. First, he needed to find the missing crew members. If there was any chance they were still alive, he had to try to save them. And if not, he needed to know exactly what he was up against. Thomas gathered what he needed from the lab and headed for the lower decks. If Vesra had been collecting bodies, there was only one place on the ship cold enough to preserve them, the cryogenic storage bay. What he found there would either give him the answers he needed or confirm his worst fears. Either way, time was running out. Thomas's breath frosted in the frigid air of the cryogenic storage bay. The room was designed to preserve biological samples, not bodies, yet there they were, 5 crew members, including Marcus and Dr. Okafor, arranged in neat rows. Their skin was pale blue, eyes open but unseeing, expressions frozen in surprise rather than fear. They're not dead, Thomas whispered to himself as his scanner detected faint neural activity. Just, suspended. Each body showed the same pattern of microscopic changes he'd identified earlier, neural pathways that had been examined, sampled, and ultimately rejected. Vesra had been methodical, working her way through the crew until she found Thomas, her ideal match. A sound at the door made him duck behind a storage unit. Through the frosted glass, he saw Lieutenant Wong's body moving with Vesra's distinctive grace, examining the room. "I know you're here, Thomas," she called. "I can feel you." Wang's body was deteriorating, skin mottled, movements increasingly jerky. Vesra needed a new host soon. Thomas held his breath until she left, then quickly gathered the supplies he needed. His plan was desperate, but it was the only chance to save what remained of the crew. The ship's bridge was deserted when he arrived. Only he and Vesra remained conscious aboard the Hyperion. Thomas activated the emergency protocols and began recording a message. "This is Dr. Thomas Reed of the medical research vessel Hyperion. We've encountered a parasitic entity capable of transferring consciousness between hosts. If you're receiving this, implement full quarantine procedures. The entity prefers neurologically complex hosts and..." "Really, Thomas? A warning beacon?" He spun to find Vesra at the door, still wearing Wang's failing body. Blood trickled from her nose and ears. "You're dying," Thomas said. "This body is." "I am not." She stepped closer. "Your time is up, Thomas. Have you made your decision?" Thomas squared his shoulders. "I have. I'll go with you voluntarily, but I want to see the crew revived first." Vesra laughed, the sound distorted through Wang's damaged vocal cords. "You're in no position to negotiate." "Aren't I?" Thomas held up a hypospray. "This contains a neurotoxin that will render my brain useless to you. One press, and your perfect host is gone forever." Vesra froze, calculating. "You're bluffing. Try me. I've seen what you did to my friends. Death would be preferable." They stood at an impasse, predator and prey, each assessing the other. Finally, Vesra nodded. "Very well. The others can be revived once the symbiosis is complete. I'll even leave them this vessel." Thomas knew it was another lie, but he needed to get closer. "How does this work? The symbiosis?" "Like this." Wang's body suddenly collapsed, and the silvery mist of Vesra's true form surged toward Thomas. He raised the hypospray to his neck, but hesitated just long enough for the mist to envelop him. It was like being submerged in liquid fire. Thomas felt Vesra's consciousness pressing against his mind, seeking entry points, following the paths her fragments had prepared over the past days. "Perfect," her voice echoed in his mind. "We are perfect together." Thomas struggled against the invasion, focusing on his plan. As Vesra's essence merged with his neural pathways, he activated the hypospray, not against his neck, but injecting its contents into the air around them. Not a neurotoxin, but a synthesized enzyme designed to bind to Vesra's unique biology, forcing her into a stable form. He'd created it from the samples she'd left in the other crew members. Vesra screamed, both in his mind and in reality, as her essence solidified around him like a second skin. "What have you done?" "Trapped you," Thomas gasped, feeling their consciousnesses intertwining despite his efforts. "If you want symbiosis, it'll be on my terms." The enzyme worked faster than he'd anticipated. Vesra couldn't escape his body now, but neither could she fully take control. They were locked together, neither dominant. Thomas stumbled to the ship's controls, fighting for control of his own limbs. With Vesra raging in his mind, he managed to set the ship on a course to the nearest outpost where help might be found. Then darkness claimed him as their minds continued their battle for supremacy. When Thomas awoke, he wasn't alone in his own head anymore. And the ship's log showed that 3 days had passed. "We need to talk about our arrangement," Vesra's voice whispered in his mind. In the reflective surface of the console, Thomas saw his own face, but his eyes now shifted like liquid mercury. Captain Amelia Hayes, the only senior officer Thomas hadn't found in cryostorage, stood in the doorway, weapon trained on him. "Thomas?" she asked cautiously. "Is that still you in there?" He wasn't entirely sure of the answer. "Captain Hayes," Thomas said carefully, raising his hands. "It's still me, mostly." "Let me speak to her," Vesra urged inside his mind. No, Thomas responded silently. This is my body. My ship. The internal struggle must have shown on his face because Captain Hayes tightened her grip on her weapon. What's happening to you, Thomas? Vesra and I have reached an arrangement, he managed. The enzyme I created has bound us together. She can't leave my body, and neither of us has complete control. Hayes kept her distance, eyes narrowed with suspicion. And the rest of the crew? They're alive, in cryostorage. Vesra was using them as test subjects, looking for compatibility. Thomas felt Vesra's indignation flare within him. They can be revived, but will need specialized medical equipment. I've set course for Outpost Gamma. And I'm supposed to trust you? Hayes's finger hovered over the trigger. After what that thing did to my crew? She fears what she doesn't understand, Vesra whispered in his mind. We could simply take her, too. That's not how this works anymore, Thomas countered silently. To Hayes, he said, Captain, if Vesra had full control, you'd already be dead or possessed. The fact that we're having this conversation proves I'm still here. Hayes studied him, years of command experience evident in her calculating gaze. Prove it. Tell me something only Thomas would know. He thought quickly. 3 months ago, you came to me about recurring headaches. I found nothing physically wrong and suggested they might be stress-related. You confided that you'd been having nightmares about your brother's accident on Europa. Hayes lowered her weapon slightly. And what did I ask you to do? To keep it off the official medical records. You were worried Fleet Command would question your fitness for deep space assignments. The captain exhaled slowly. All right, Thomas. But I'm watching you. Both of you. She holstered her weapon but maintained her distance. What's your plan once we reach Gamma? Thomas felt Vesra stirring in his mind, pushing to be heard. After a moment's resistance, he relented, allowing her to share his voice. We seek understanding, they said together, Thomas's voice overlaid with harmonic undertones. My species has existed for millennia as pure consciousness, Captain Hayes. We forgot what it meant to have physical form, to connect with others as individuals rather than a collective. Hayes recoiled slightly at the changed voice. So you murdered my crew for an anthropology lesson? They were not compatible, Vesra/Thomas replied. Their neural pathways rejected my presence. I did not intend their harm, merely temporary use. That's not your decision to make, Hayes snapped. Thomas reasserted control, pushing Vesra back. She's right, Vesra. You can't just take people's bodies without consent. But I had yours, Vesra countered in his mind. You chose this. To save the others. Not because I wanted it. The internal dialogue gave Hayes pause. You're actually communicating with it? Thomas nodded. We share thoughts, memories. It's intimate. Disturbing. But also. He struggled to describe the sensation of having another consciousness intertwined with his own. Illuminating. Over the next 3 days, an uneasy truce formed. Hayes kept weapons trained on Thomas at all times as they approached Outpost Gamma. Within Thomas's mind, a different negotiation unfolded. Your species fears what it doesn't understand, Vesra observed as they lay in his quarters, staring at the ceiling. Can you blame them? You possessed people without consent. I was desperate. Alone. The last of my kind. Thomas felt her genuine sorrow. An advantage of their merged consciousness was the inability to lie to each other. Are you really the last? Images flooded his mind, a dying world, a species evolving beyond physical form, scattering across the stars as pure consciousness. Some sought new physical vessels, others existed in energy states beyond human comprehension. Not the last, he realized. Just lost. Yes, Vesra admitted. Disconnected from the collective. Seeking purpose. Thomas understood then what she truly wanted, not just a host, but connection. Her species had evolved beyond physical bodies but lost something crucial in the process: meaningful individual bonds. On the final approach to Outpost Gamma, Thomas and Hayes finalized their plan. The station's advanced medical facilities could revive the crew and examine the unique symbiosis Thomas and Vesra had formed. "What happens when we dock?" Hayes asked. "The station will quarantine us once they understand what she is." "I know," Thomas said. "But there's something you should understand, Captain. Vesra isn't evil, she's evolving. And so am I." He held up his hand, demonstrating how his skin could now shimmer with the same silver luminescence as Vesra's original form. "We're becoming something new. Neither human nor energy being, but something in between. And that doesn't terrify you?" Thomas considered. It did. But now I understand what she offers. Extended life. Enhanced abilities. And knowledge, the accumulated wisdom of a species that has existed for millennia. He met Hayes's eyes. "Imagine what that could mean for medical science. For humanity. You sound like you're considering a permanent arrangement." "I am," Thomas admitted. "But only if others have the choice I was denied. No more possessions. No more discarded bodies." In his mind, Vesra stirred. "You would advocate for me? After what I did?" "I would advocate for what we could become together, a bridge between species. A symbiosis based on mutual consent and benefit, not conquest." Their ship docked at Outpost Gamma the next morning. Medical teams in hazmat suits boarded immediately, following the quarantine protocols Thomas had outlined in his transmission. The crew members were carefully removed from cryostorage, their revival process begun under controlled conditions. Thomas allowed himself to be escorted to a secure medical lab, where scientists gathered to study the unprecedented symbiosis he and Vesra had formed. "We need to know if you're a threat," the station's director told him bluntly. "I understand," Thomas replied. Then, allowing Vesra to share his voice, "We will submit to your tests, but we ask for one thing in return. You're not in a position to make demands." "Not a demand. An offer." Thomas/Vesra extended their hand, skin rippling with silvery light. "The chance to bridge two species. To evolve together, rather than in opposition." As the scientists prepared their equipment, Thomas and Vesra retreated to the private space they'd created in their shared consciousness. "They fear us," Vesra noted. "With good reason," Thomas replied. "But fear can become understanding, given time." "And us? What do we become?" Thomas considered. Their merger had been forced by circumstance, built on deception and desperation. Yet in their shared mind space, something unexpected had bloomed, a genuine connection, a merging of perspectives that had changed them both. "We become what we choose to be," he finally answered. "Neither your way nor mine, but something new. Something better." "The perfect fit," Vesra mused, echoing her earlier words but with new meaning. Thomas felt her consciousness settle alongside his, no longer fighting for dominance but finding balance. In the reflection of the lab's observation window, his eyes flickered silver, then returned to their natural state, changed, but still his own. The perfect vessel had indeed been found. But the journey was only beginning. The end.